Years ago, there was a preacher who I knew, not intimately, but enough, and he said that he'd preached a message on why I like Jonah. And he went on to tell me the outline, and kind of the title stuck in my head. But when he gave me the outline, it wasn't something that, was impressed me much. But I thought about that. Most of the time when we come to a book like the book of Jonah, our focus is wrong. The book of Jonah is not about Jonah. The book of Jonah is about God. And I hope that as we dissect this book, that you'll see that our focus needs to be less on him, his flaws and failures, and more on him and his faithfulness. And I hope that this, in fact, I think when I think of the book of Jonah, most of you have taught Sunday school class at some point in time, and it's the perfect Sunday school lesson to teach in a junior church or a Sunday school, because the little eyes go wide open as they hear the story about the great fish and the swallowing of Jonah. And so it oftentimes becomes a go-to story for Sunday school. Some of us as adults, perhaps we too have read these few chapters, and we've thought how interesting it is to dive into the details of this. Critics love this story. You know why they love it? Because they love to find fault with it. And they think, how could this be? A guy gets swallowed by a fish and he lives. Well, he didn't live. He died. And that's the point of it. And it's kind of like that professor. Do you know the college kid went off to college, and the professor, she came back home and she said, my professor said, it just didn't make any sense how that an ark was big enough that all the animals could get in it, and yet they were able to transport it for 40 years through the wilderness. You got it. Yeah. Ignorance, Don't show it. Just sometimes it's better not to say anything than to say something stupid, and I've been there. And that goes along with this book of Jonah, because the critics love it, because they just look at it as it's beyond credibility. And the other thing that, in kind of introduction here, is the brevity of it. It's less than 50 verses. The brevity ought not to cause us to think that it's not significant. This book is as significant as the book of Romans. When you analyze it and when you delve into it, the truths in it, just because it's short doesn't mean it's not powerful and meaningful and helpful and relevant. Sometimes we write volumes of books about the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, or Civil War, or World War II, and there are multiple volumes written about those things, historical events. And yet God took and compressed truths in just 50 short, or less than 50 short verses that exceed all the information as far as staggering that you would get in all those volumes. So you get volumes of truth in just a short book. In contrast, oftentimes those volumes of books don't have much truth. Here's the first truth, and you'll find it here in the beginning, verse 3. And kind of the lead up here is that Jonah is interacting. The Lord came to Jonah, and he said, arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, cry against it, for their wickedness is come up before me. But Jonah rose up to flee unto Tarshish. That would be the direction of Spain, in contrast to the direction of Nineveh, which would have been north, east instead of north. From, here's the key phrase, from the presence of the Lord. There is a repetition of that phrase on down in the same verse. And went down to Joppa, and he found a ship going to Tarshish, so he paid the fare thereof, and went down in it to go with them unto Tarshish. Here it is again, from the presence of the Lord. If you'll skip down to verse number 10, even those who were on the ship and were part and parcel with his the consequences of this running from the presence of the Lord, even they acknowledged this. Then were the men exceedingly afraid, and said unto him, Why hast thou done this? For the men knew that he fled from the presence of the Lord. Now think of the impact of just that little phrase, the presence of the Lord. Jonah was one of the few people of all people that lived. If we were to stack up proportionately all the prophets that had ever lived, proportionately to the billions of people that have lived, they would be fractional. And Jonah was part of those few, those rare men who were called to communicate what God said to people. That was the job of the prophet. And yet, it says in 2 Kings chapter 11, verse 26, that he was a prophet in Israel, and he had done his job there in Israel. And yet, it seems as though he took that task lightly, or perhaps didn't appreciate it, that God would give him an audience. I don't know how you value those moments when God meets with you and interacts with you in a special way. From the presence of the Lord, it says. He ran from the presence of the Lord. It reminds me of David's prayer after he had done what he did with Bathsheba, and he was confronted by Nathan. And when he made his prayer in Psalm 51, one of the phrases he uses is, Cast me not from thy presence. There are a lot of things that I can endure. I don't like pain, but I've endured a little bit of it in life. But the one thing I can't endure, the one thing that is the most precarious, is the idea that God would somehow no longer let me into his presence. Isn't that a terrible thought? And it was for David, even though he had engaged in this behavior, even though he had been confronted for his sin, even though he had expressed, Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation. It was the presence of the Lord that he desired. I wonder sometimes if we value the presence of the Lord. Moses in the burning bush took off his shoes at 80 years old, having lived in the wilderness for 40 years out of the palace, and now in the wilderness. And when he encountered the Lord in the burning bush, he encountered the presence of the Lord. Isaiah, when he was a young preacher, it says in Isaiah 6, in the day that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, he said. And he was surrounded by the cherubims. Think of that for a moment, what it would be like for a young preacher like Isaiah to be in the presence of the Lord. Do you think that either Moses or Isaiah would trade 1 minute, one fraction of a minute of that presence of the Lord for all the things that they could experience otherwise? Think how ridiculous it is for what Jonah did here in verse 3 when it says that he fled from the presence of the Lord. Doesn't it seem ridiculous to me? Where are you going to go? How are you going to hide? It's kind of like Adam in the Garden of Eden and putting fig leaves on. Here's the one who made you and knows your anatomy, and you're ashamed because you're naked and you put fig leaves on. And it's because the presence of the Lord has this ability to burn through all the surface stuff. You remember what Isaiah said when he was in the presence of the Lord. He said, I'm a man of unclean lips. One of the reasons that maybe we avoid the presence of the Lord is because we see ourselves a little too unvarnished. And Jonah certainly saw himself in that way. The question I ask myself is this. What cheap thrill would I exchange for just one moment in the presence of the Lord? What's worth it? A ride on a roller coaster, like David, an excursion into immorality, some monetary enrichment. What is it? What is it that you would deem valuable enough that you'd say, I'd exchange that for this moment in God's presence? And yet, Jonah did. Can I submit to you just for a moment that, and you can hold here in the book of Jonah, go back to book of Psalms, chapter 14. Can I submit to you that I believe that every single human being on the face of the earth has a presence of God moment at some point in time. Look what Psalm 14 and verse 1 says. Now, one of the things that I value about the King James translators is these 54 men and 50 at the very end of the whole project. One of the things I value about it is their honesty. Notice the italicized words in verse 1. It says, there is... the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Those are italicized. And the reason they're italicized is those honest King James translators said the Hebrew word doesn't actually indicate that those two words are there, but for the continuity of the sentence, we placed it there. Let us read it as it would be. Listen, the fool hath said in his heart, no God. Do you catch the emphasis there? The idea that I would say to God when confronted with his presence, whether it's the atheist or whether it's the fool who is not an atheist, whoever he may be, who says to God, I would exchange what I want. No, God. Rather than experience your presence. Because it has some implication, the Isaiah experience when in Isaiah 6, when the dialogue continued between God and him, and God said, whom shall I send? And Isaiah said, I'll go. And God continued the conversation and said, here's what will happen if you go. They're not going to hear. And for the next 60 years of Isaiah's life, he did exactly what he said he would do as a young man that had been initiated by that presence of God experience. I don't want to miss out on the presence of God. I don't want to foolishly say as the fool in Psalm 14, no, God. When have you shied away from the presence of God? Jonah is not alone. By the way, a lost person. You may be here unsaved. You have had to answer the question when the presence of God is when you're confronted by the presence of God, will I respond or reject? But there's room at the cross for you, just like there was for me as a teenage boy. God desires for us to be in his presence. Will we flee from it? That's what strikes me about this. It's more about God. He's not avoiding us. He wants us in his presence. Look down in verse 17. And I said at the onset, the introduction, that this is more about God than about Jonah. Look in verse 17. It says, and the Lord had prepared a great fish. Now, we'll look at a number of things that he prepared, but the thing that strikes me about God is that he is always preparing things. I hesitate to say 10 steps ahead because he sees the end. He sees the last tick on the clock that one day will come. Time no more. He has already seen time no more. And he says in the book of Psalms that the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord. Why? Because he sees that future. Does he force me or coerce me or make me to make the decisions that he wants me to make? No, but he orchestrates the plan. The steps of a good man or woman are ordered by the Lord. Preparation. How much preparation goes into just bringing one person to Christ? How much of the foreknowledge of God have you come to appreciate? Look at the things that he prepares. Back in verse 4, he prepared a wind. We'll see that again when we get to chapter 4. But he prepared a wind when Jonah fled. And so he put the wind in the path. And you understand that the people who are worshiping at the altar of climate control, you know that's a religion. It's not It's not about climate control. It's about people control. You understand that, don't you? I hope you do. I hope you're careful about God's environment. I hope all of those things. But it's doubtful that you're going to change the ice caps that much just because you recycle, you know. I got a notion where some of that recycle stuff goes anyhow, to be honest with you. But that's not the subject. God's in control. In the disciples, it says, they were shocked when Jesus awoke and the winds and the waves obeyed his voice. God prepares a wind. He wasn't surprised when Jonah did what he did. And I don't know when the wind was started to be. He didn't snap his fingers and make it happen. He could have. But the wind patterns had developed, and the ship is now moving out in the Mediterranean Sea and moving in the wrong direction, and the wind begins to get larger and larger until it creates this unsafe environment where they're crying out for their lives. It's God who prepared that wind. In verse 17, it's God who prepared that fish. And note it says that when that he prepared the great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. I kind of casually alluded to this earlier, but I believe he was dead. The reason I believe it is it's the same thing. Jesus says as Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights, Jesus was literally dead. He didn't swoon. He wasn't partially dead. He was altogether dead. You say, is there another precedent for this? Yes. In John chapter 11, Lazarus was dead. And when he said, roll away the stone, they protested and say, by now he stinketh. It's the 4th day. And the Lord Jesus breathed life back into this dead body. And it came forth, and they said, unravel. That's the same thing here. You see, he couldn't have made this prayer while he was dead, but that brings us to the next preparation, chapter number 2. In verse 1 and 2, he makes a prayer. Do you know what has to happen between chapter 1 and verse 17 and 3 days passing? Do you know what has to happen between that verse and chapter 2, verse 1 and 2, where it says he prayed and cried by reason of mine affliction? Do you know what would have to happen? He'd have to have happen exactly what happened to Lazarus there in Bethany. The life of God was breathed back into this man who had been dead in the belly of this fish, and there in the next 30 to 60 seconds, he makes his prayer, and like the grave cloths are cast aside for Lazarus, so it is with him. He makes his prayer in verses 3 through 9, and he vows, and he says, I'll do what you said, and just get me out of this belly. I'm alive now. I can, this doesn't taste good. And so the fish vomits him out. He prepared a resurrection. He prepared a salvation. That's in verse 9. Salvation is of the Lord. I know that I was saved as a teenage boy, and it was once and for all. It'll never change. I can't go back. I can't say to him, I changed my mind. I don't want to be saved anymore. It's not. I took you into my family. We're not going to play that game. You come in and come out. And in fact, we're going to deal with this in a different way. We're going to deal with this in a parental way now. Initially, I had to deal with you as a lost person. Now I'm dealing with you as a son. And whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. Whom the Lord loveth, he correcteth. Proverbs chapter 3. And so we go from being a child of God to being a son of God who's being corrected. And I need the salvation of the Lord repeated, not salvation in regard to being saved as far as eternity, but salvation from my own the consequences of my own decisions. Repeatedly. That brings us to chapter number 4. This probably is, and we'll go back and develop chapter 3 a little bit. In fact, let's just do this just real quick, because we 1, 2, 3, and 4. He washes all the vomit off and goes into the city, and it says he started preaching. I think it can be said that there is no less compassionate preacher than Jonah. He said, I'm going to get this thing over with and get back to Israel and get back to where I'm familiar. I dislike these people. And he should, because they have done some terrible things to the people of Israel over the years. The Ninevites were terrible. They ravaged the nation of Israel. They took their resources. They did all kinds of things. God allowed it as discipline, but Jonah developed a disdain for them. And he said to himself, I'm out of this fish. I'm going to get the job done. And buddy, when I get it done, they're going to burn. And I can't wait. So here it is. So Jonah arose, verse 3, went to Nineveh, and according to the word of the Lord, now Nineveh was a great city, a 3 days journey. So we're not talking about a small place. We're talking about comparable to a New York City or something of that, proportionate-wise. And he's walking along, and it says and Jonah began to enter into the city of the day, and he cried and said, yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. I can't wait.
And day after day, these 3 days, he's accomplishing this thing and he's getting the task done. And what he doesn't realize that in his wake from verse 5 to verse 10 are all these people hearing this message and they're falling on their faces in repentance and he could care less. You see, because this is about God, not about Jonah. And he just gets it done. And in chapter 4, he gets outside the city, and it says he was displeased because God heard their response of repentance and responded to them in kindness. And it displeased him, it said. And in fact, it says he was very angry. And he prayed to the Lord and said, I pray thee, O Lord, was not this my saying when I was yet in my country? You made me travel hundreds of miles to people I disdain. And I told you that I didn't want anything to do with these people. And I knew who you were. I've been in your presence and watched you be kind and long-suffering and all of those things. And I didn't want it to happen here, he said. Therefore now, Lord, O Lord, take, I beseech thee, my life from me, for it's better for me to die than to live. Do you know what causes that kind of suicidal? One of my riders that I've had, that I've transported, Amish riders, you don't think of this very often, but he just, their dad went to the barn and took a rope and hung himself in just the last week or two. And I said to one of my other riders when he told me this, I said, yeah, I took people and I didn't know the circumstances. And I said, what do you think caused that? And he said, he didn't answer. He said, oh, maybe he was depressed or he had some physical. I said, there's only one cause, and that is when you get to the place where you have no hope. And then I looked at him, and I stopped and said, do you think you know where hope is? Can you find where hope is? And I never talked anymore, didn't say anything more. Because I want those wheels to turn in that head, thinking about that man who hung himself without any hope. And when this man gets to the place where he has no hope, where's he going to find it? Not at the end of a rope. That's where Jonah's at. Jeremiah came to that place. Elijah came to that place. When we're running, when we're fleeing from the presence of the Lord, when we're ignoring the preparations of God, and we don't realize that this all stuff is happening for our benefit always, it says, and for our good always, it says in the New Testament. When we don't recognize it, we end up like Jonah said, it's better if I just die. And look at the question in verse 4. Here's, most good teachers begin the lesson with a question. Here's all these other preparations, the wind and the fish and the resurrection and the salvation and all that. All these preparations are leading to this preparation. God's such a good Father. He's such a good teacher. He's got the lesson plan laid out way out in advance. And so what God does is begins the lesson, the correction, with a question. Here it is. Dost thou well to be angry? And if you'll notice something, there's no response recorded. In a little bit, you'll see there is a response. So in lieu of this, Jonah is saying to himself, I'm not going to talk to him. This bugs me. He said, goes out and builds himself or makes himself, it says, a made himself a booth in verse 4, sat under the booth in the shadow that he might see what would become of the city. He said, held out hope that maybe God's going to change his mind and kill these people. I hate them. And so God in his gracious correctional means takes the next step. Look what he prepares in the next verse. A gourd. This would be a tree with big broad leaves. How long does it take to prepare something like this? The soil is prepared. The seed is planted. The water is put in. The sun comes. How long does... So God is looking way up ahead, and he sees Jonah in his raggedy booth and says, I'm going to give him a nice, comfortable gourd tree with broad leaves to shield him from the sunlight so he can keep on watching in case I kill these people. And he's teaching him something. And Jonah, look at the mood swing. See it in verse 6? What's the mood swing now? He goes from very angry in verse 1 to exceeding glad. Man, he's exhilarated. Whew, this feels good. God's still preparing something. Look what he prepared next. And here's what struck me about God. Over the years, and 50 some odd years of serving the Lord, every time I've gotten comfortable or on this mountaintop of my own making, you know what God prepares? He prepares a worm. See that in the next verse? He prepared a worm, and the worm burrowed into the gourd, and the word made it, and it says it withered. And the next day, verse 8, he prepared a wind, so a worm and a wind, and those two things combined together destroyed all the exhilaration that Jonah was experiencing. And I'm saying to myself, I have a God who wants me in his presence. And I have a God who patiently prepares those things that strip me of my comfort zone for my good. I don't always like it. I'm a little like Jonah sometimes. How's come? Why is this? And yet God in his graciousness. Now, here's the second time he asked the question, because when the gourd dies and the sun beats on him, it says in verse 8, and he faints, and verse 9, God, so the second time he asked the same question he asked him back in verse 4. He said, dost thou well to be angry for the gourd? This time, Jonah had the unmitigated gall to say, yeah, I do. Unbelievable how sometimes God does things for our benefit and we can't even recognize it. The gourd was a tool. The worm was a tool. The wind was a tool. It was not to make Jonah's life miserable, but it was to make Jonah's life in sync with his. And that brings us to the very last piece of this puzzle. Look in chapter 4, verse 11. The whole objective of this is to bring him here. To align Jonah with God's value system. You see it in verse 11. He said, should not I spare Nineveh, that great city, wherein are more than 70,000 persons that cannot discern their right hand and their left. Now, simplifying it, we have 60,000 people in this city that haven't learned yet what's the difference between the right hand and the left hand. That would be infants and babies. If there are 60,000 infants and babies, there must be tens of thousands of adolescents and tens of thousands of teenagers and tens of thousands of adults and tens of thousands of seniors. And now the number just keeps multiplying exponentially until there are hundreds of thousands of people in this city. Jonah, don't you see? These are human beings. Now understand something, 100 years later, the same message is going to come by the voice of Nahum that came by Jonah. This time they don't repent, and this time God does mete out judgment in Nahum's day on Nineveh. But they had repented. What do you want me to do with them, Jonah? You want me to say, oh yeah, I hear you. Now I'm going to kill you all. Aligning with the purpose of God. That's the idea. You see, the purpose of God. If there's one thing that's evident in all of Scripture, 2 Peter chapter 3, God is not willing that any should perish. That doesn't mean any won't perish, but he doesn't want them to. But that all should come to repentance doesn't mean they all will. But that's the purpose of God. God's presence is available. God's preparation is evident. And God's purpose has never changed from the very first lamb or animal that was slain in the garden when Adam and Eve sinned. And a coat was made. It was evident when Abraham and God had the conversation about Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham said, "But would you save them if there were 50 people that were righteous?" "Oh yeah," God said. You see, God's purpose is not destruction. God's purpose is salvation. And when destruction comes, all else has been exhausted. And Abraham says, well, 40? How about 40 righteous? How about 30, 20? And 10, obviously there's going to be 10. There's Mrs. Lot, my nephew, and Mrs. Lot, and I'm sure that at least 8 of their children or grandchildren have become believers too there in Lot. And Abraham in his mind must have thought, surely there's 10. And God said, yeah, if there's 10 righteous, I'll save the city. God's purpose is for the salvation of mankind. This is for the old timers. Do you remember the old black and white fugitive David Jansen series? Yeah. At the end of that thing, there was always an epilogue. You guys that are English majors, you understand the epilogue. It's kind of at the end of the story, and it kind of connects to the next week. You know, what's going to happen to Jansen next week? You know, where is he going to be? And it kind of ties up all the loose ends after he's escaped whatever is escaped. Can I throw an epilogue here? This is all conjecture. There's no scripture in here to verify all of this. But I want you to think about it in lieu of how we respond to the presence of God and the preparations of God and the purposes of God. I wonder if after verse 11, Jonah reacted like Isaiah and fell to his face and said, I'm a man of unclean lips. I wonder if we had we never hear anything more about Jonah from this point on other than just our historical reference, but not continuation. I wonder if after this interaction in verse 11, if Jonah said, God, I see now. And he ran back to the city of Nineveh and rejoiced with all the people that are singing and praying and rejoicing about their sins being forgiven and salvation coming to this great city. I wonder I wonder if he went back home to Israel, a changed preacher. He'd have been a prophet in Israel, 2 Kings says. And yet, he didn't have the heart of God. And I just wonder if he went back a changed prophet. I don't know, and we'll never know until eternity. But here are the questions we can ask ourselves in light of that or in lieu of that. Have I ever fled from the presence of God? Am I fleeing from the presence of God? Is the presence of God just a little bit too intrusive? What's so important? What's so valuable? What's worth cheating me out of the presence of God? What is it? Have I forgotten how much preparation that went into just you being saved? Out of all the billions that have ever lived of people, God has made all kinds of preparations. Just before the foundation of the earth, he prepared things so you could come into the family of God. Have you forgotten that? And not just you, but every human being, he's made preparations. Some have rejected it, and God won't overcome that rejection. That's the will of man to respond or reject. But all those preparations to bring me to salvation and then to bring me to sanctification, closer to him. His staggering plans, not just placing the stars in the sky, but taking a human being from point A and changing them literally from that person to that person. All those plans and preparations. Thirdly, the question would be, are my purposes aligned with God's? That's real simple, isn't it? These people repented, and God saw it, and God repented, and they were transformed. But Jonah didn't see it. Maybe after verse 11 he did. I don't know. But do I? What's the most grotesque behavior that you see evidenced in our culture? I've seen some grotesque things. Gay pride stuff and the behavior before little children and that kind of thing. It's grotesque. What if somehow the gospel penetrated that person's heart? How would we respond to them if they, like the Ninevites, fell to their knees? Would we say, yeah, but I despise that person? Or would we say, as God, welcome in? So those are the questions that I ask in relative to God's presence and preparation, God's purpose. Have I fled from it? Have I forgotten it? Am I aligned with it? And if I can see that in this little book, it'll change my perspective. It's not about Jonah. It's about God. It's not even about me. It's about God. See who he is in this book. He's far more than I can ever, in my little feeble brain and mouth and lips, communicate to you. This is God. So simple. A third grade education would be able to understand something like this. And yet so profound, so eternal, like nuggets from a gold mine, a diamond mine, more valuable than all the riches of all the world. Pray with me, please.